What's up, rock fans, and welcome back to Get Your Rock Off. Now, we can probably all agree that Black Sabbath is a rock band. There's just no getting around it. They both rock and roll. I mean, boy oh boy, these bloody blokes could play. Now, who is Black Sabbath? We got the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne, on the mic wailing those dark melodies. Tony Iommi on guitar, laying down those heavy riffs and ripping blazing solos. We got Geezer Butler picking those bass lines, writing those spooky lyrics. And then you got Bill Ward on drums, thundering away on the heavy artillery, baby. The classic Sabbath lineup that pioneered heavy metal. And then, of course, there's the 200 other members that played in Black Sabbath in the 80s and 90s. Most notably, however, Ronnie James Dio, the little guy with the big voice, Vinny Appice, the Italian stallion, and sure, fuck it, let's talk about Tony Martin. Ian Gillan, Glenn Hughes, we love you. Thanks for your contributions to the band, I guess? But Chief called, so we're not talking about you in this video. Now, if you're a rock nerd like me, you love a good live album. Black Sabbath is a band from the 70s. Live albums were all the rage back then. Everyone was releasing one. Such classics like Frampton Comes Alive, Kiss Alive, Cheap Trick Live at the Budokan, Wings Over America, Judas Priest with Unleashed in the East, Strangers in the Night from UFO, and the list goes on and on. But for some reason at the time, Black Sabbath did not jump on the bandwagon. Why? I'm not sure. Ozzy was probably like, fucking hell. And Tony was probably like, bloody hell. Geezer was probably trying to conjure something from hell in some evil ritual, and Bill was probably drunk. Of course, now we know that there are many Sabbath live recordings, but the first one that was ever released wasn't even the band's idea. In fact, they didn't even know it was being released. Live at Last arrived in 1980, and the only reason why it exists is because Sabbath's jilted, greedy former manager, Patrick Meehan, owned the rights to a 1973 performance by the band and released it without their consent. The concert was recorded 7 years prior by the band themselves, intended to be released, but they decided to shelve it because apparently they weren't happy with the performance. It's also a very short album, as it's only 9 tracks long, and it fails to include some classics. Live at Last was re-released as one of the discs of a 2-disc set called Past Lives in 2002, so Sabbath did wind up giving it an official release 22 years later. Only recently, on the Super Deluxe version of Volume 4, did the entire 1973 show get restored to its full setlist and remastered. So that's definitely the best version of the recording. At any rate, the release of Live at Last prompted the band to put out their own official live release. Now, Sabbath fans know that in 1979, Ozzy Osbourne was fired by the band and replaced with Ronnie James Dio, formerly of Elf and Rainbow. With Sabbath gearing up to release a live album with Dio, Ozzy raced to record a live album of his own and get his on shelves before his former band. The Ozzy record in question is Speak of the Devil, which is comprised of only Black Sabbath songs recorded live by Ozzy's solo band. The decision to record only Sabbath songs was made by Osbourne's management, for a few reasons. In fact, the whole saga behind the making of Speak of the Devil is actually really interesting, as Ozzy's solo band was not into the idea of recording an album of only Black Sabbath covers, as they had already released 2 albums with Ozzy. Then, of course, in 1982, guitarist Randy Rhoads tragically died in a plane crash. Eventually, a spot in the band was filled by Night Ranger guitarist Brad Gillis. Previously recorded versions of Iron Man, Children of the Grave, and Paranoid with Rhoads on guitar were originally to be included on Speak of the Devil, but last minute they decided to hold on to those for a later release. So yeah, Ozzy's management was already planning another future live album while they were trying to put together the first one. The 3 songs were released 5 years later on the live record entitled Randy Rhoads Tribute, and they are far superior to the versions that appear on Speak of the Devil in my opinion. I like them because I prefer Rhoads playing to Gillis, but in all fairness, Gillis and the band were originally told not to bother rehearsing the songs in question because of the original idea of using the Rhoads recorded tracks. Brad Gillis does shred, however. He's a great guitarist. He approaches the Sabbath material with his own spin, which is why live albums are cool after all. You get to hear how different players sound and different renditions or spins bands put on the live performances of certain songs. The album is a great listen if you like Gillis' playing. At the very least, it's interesting to hear his take on the Sabbath material. Ozzy is also in great form. However, his vocals aren't 100% live, but pretty much every live album ever has been doctored in some way. I'm looking at you, Unleashed, in the studio. In the meantime, Black Sabbath was gearing up to release their own live album, Live Evil. Now, Sabbath had also released 2 records since Ozzy's departure, with Dio. So Live Evil is cool to me because not only does it have all the classic Sabbath material sung by Dio, but it also has material from the Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules albums. This album to me is more interesting because the novelty of hearing Dio sing Ozzy's songs. Their voices are so different, yet Dio fits right in, and the band is ripping in this performance. And this isn't a knock at Gillis, but of course Tony's playing is what you want to hear on the first official live Sabbath record. But again, this is Sabbath's first live album, and it features a different lead singer than their original. So while it's cool, it still doesn't feel like the definitive Black Sabbath live album. And I love Dio, I love all the albums he did with the band, but his iteration of the band is so different that they might as well be 2 different acts altogether. And technically, in 2007, that became the case, but we'll get to that a bit later. At the end of the day, Ozzy's plan to beat out Sabbath to the release worked. Speak of the Devil was released 1 month before Live Evil and outsold the latter, although Live Evil did chart higher in the UK, for what it's worth. The making of Live Evil was the undoing of that iteration of the band, and after that, everyone and their mother joined and subsequently left Black Sabbath. After a couple of Deep Purple singers came and went, Tony Iommi, the last remaining original member, found singer Tony Martin, who would front the band and be featured on Sabbath's next live release, but not before recording 4 studio albums with the band. Well, he recorded 3, Eternal Idol, Headless Cross, and Tear. Then, Iommi fired him to reunite with Dio for the Dehumanizer album. But after the release of that album, things went south with Dio again. Iommi rehired Martin in order to record the Cross Purposes record, as well as the subsequent Cross Purposes Live. Now, what is there to say about Cross Purposes Live? Well, you know, it exists. Why? Who knows? Did they need a live album with Martin called Black Sabbath? Again, this is another band altogether. The sound of the Martin records are so far and away from the original Black Sabbath sound. In my mind, in my headcanon, I don't consider Martin albums Black Sabbath, but rather just another cool metal band from the 80s. And the Martin albums are not bad. Well, not those first 4. Then there's Forbidden, which I forbid myself from talking or even thinking about. Now, I'm not as familiar with the Martin era of Sabbath as I am of the original classic lineup or the Dio era, and who is really? So that also for me makes this record less interesting personally. Out of the 16 tracks, 3 of them are from Cross Purposes, 1 from both Headless Cross and Tear, while Eternal Idol is not represented at all. The rest of the album is rounded out by 4 Dio-era tracks and the remaining 8 from Ozzy's tenure. Although that's on the full VHS and later DVD release, the CD only has 14 tracks, as Mob Rules, Neon Nights, and Anno Mundi were cut, I assume to fit the recording on 1 disc. The thing about this album is I feel like Martin's voice isn't so strong in the performance, and either way I don't really care for his renditions of Ozzy and Dio's Sabbath material. Sorry, Tony. I would definitely call this album the black sheep of Sabbath live records. Now we've come to the big one. Reunion. Of course, we all know the boys from Birmingham got back together in the late 90s, and what better way to celebrate a reunion than to release a live record? Fuck studio albums. It's not taking the easy route. It's not a cash grab. We needed this live album. But what to call it? Well, what else? Reunion. Now, this album was a big deal because the reunion tour itself was a big deal. The band had reunited for some one-off performances over the years, in 1985, for example, for Live Aid, and in 1992 for some shows on Ozzy's No More Tours tour, but they had never come back together for a full-fledged reunion tour. Not to mention, this album contained 2 new studio tracks, which would be the first time the fans would hear the original 4 members on a new song since 1978's Never Say Die. It would also be the last time because Bill Ward does not appear on the very last Sabbath studio effort, 13. This album's fun because the excitement of the crowd is palatable. I mean, even on the first track, War Pigs, the audience is trading verses with Ozzy loudly, and this kind of successful crowd interaction makes a live show fun to be a part of. Here it's cool to be a fly on the wall for what was probably a great night for the band and the fans. Maybe not the best performance of all time, but I think it's really solid. I enjoy listening to tracks from this one. Of course, it only includes music from the first 8 albums with Ozzy. Well, actually only 7 because Never Say Die is not represented. I guess hardcore fans could argue about the set list, but it has all the hits and a few deeper cuts as well. This album also earned Black Sabbath their first Grammy for their performance of Iron Man. Next up is Past Lives, which I mentioned earlier. It's a 2-disc set, the first being a re-release of the Live at Last album, and the second being a mix of recordings made for TV and radio in the 1970s. Like the first disc, the songs on that second disc were also re-released on the Super Deluxe editions. Tracks 1 and 5 through 9 were released on the Paranoid Super Deluxe, and were massively cleaned up. The versions on this disc are pretty poor quality, so again, check out those Super Deluxe releases. The rest of the songs, tracks 2, 3, and 4 are from the 1975 concert and are on the Sabotage Super Deluxe, again, remastered versions. Overall, this entire release is now moot because better versions of the same recordings are now available. Now it comes to the technically not Black Sabbath part. In 2006, Ronnie James Dio, Vinny Appice, Tony Iommi, and Geezer Butler got back together to work on a new project. Now, this is the Dio era of Sabbath. In fact, the project they were working on was called Black Sabbath, The Dio Years, which was a compilation with 3 new recorded songs. The newly reformed band went out on the road to support it, and it was a big comeback for the guys. But they were not touring as Black Sabbath. Instead, they went out under the name Heaven and Hell. This was Tony Iommi's choice, and his reasoning was to differentiate the 2 lineups of the band, the Ozzy-fronted version and the Dio-fronted version. This also probably kept Ozzy happy and Sharon's trap shut, although Dio didn't seem to agree or really understand it. Either way, they were great, whatever their name was. Now, the Dio Years was released in 2007, as was 2 live albums. One was Live at Hammersmith Odeon, released under the Black Sabbath name, which were recordings from 1981 and 82, and another record released under the Heaven and Hell moniker, Live from Radio City Music Hall. Now, Heaven and Hell did release their own original material in 2009, The Devil You Know, and it's great, but this was 2 years prior, so all the songs from Live from Radio City are actually Black Sabbath songs. So 2 out of the 3 releases from the same lineup in the same year were called Black Sabbath, and one album, which features only Black Sabbath songs, was called Heaven and Hell. So, yeah, whatever. Live from Radio City Music Hall is not a Black Sabbath album, but it is, but it isn't. As for the albums themselves, Live at Hammersmith Odeon is good, but nothing special considering Live Evil was recorded around the same time. There's nothing exactly new here, but it does feature a 14.5-minute long version of Heaven and Hell, which is the longest rendition of any of these live releases. So, there's that. Live from Radio City Music Hall is much more interesting, in my opinion, because it's got that reunion excitement, baby. Plus, it's got tracks from Dehumanizer and the Dio Years compilation. Sadly, Dio passed away in 2010 from stomach cancer, and there would be no more Heaven and Hell. Except there was, kind of. One more live album was released by Heaven and Hell after Dio's death called Neon Nights, 30 Years of Heaven and Hell, which was recorded in 2009 and features songs from the Heaven and Hell album, The Devil You Know, which is the only thing that really differentiates it at all from the Live from Radio City Music Hall album. Of course, as us Sabbath faithfuls know, the band was relaunched in 2011 with the original lineup. However, after the announcement of the reunion, Bill Ward decided not to participate as he just couldn't figure out how to sign that darn contract. So unfortunately, it was only 3/4 of the OG lineup, with Tommy Clufedo stepping in on the drums. So they went out on tour and then of course recorded 13, which would be the last full studio album by the band. In 2017, the band finished their farewell tour and retired. But before that, they released an EP called The End, which consisted of 4 leftover songs from 13 and 4 live tracks, which included 3 renditions of songs from 13. Then, after the conclusion of the farewell tour, came the final Black Sabbath release. Ever, until it's not. But for now, it is. I'm talking about The End, live in Birmingham. Now, the production and mixing are really nice on this baby, although the song choices aren't that far off from that reunion album, aside from a few substitutions, although I guess that's to be expected at this point in the band's career. The main difference is that at this point, Ozzy is 68 years old, and obviously his voice has aged quite a bit. It's not as strong on this one. The main reason that makes this album special is that it's the last show of the last Black Sabbath tour, literally their final performance. So it's the emotional aspect that gives this one its power. The only real shame is that Bill Ward isn't featured at all, as it would have been nice to have him there at the last Black Sabbath show, even if he only played a song or 2. Now you're probably saying, my guy, What about those super deluxe releases you mentioned earlier? Don't you worry, I'm going to tell you about those. In 2016, Sabbath released the first one, Paranoid Super Deluxe, a remastered collection of the iconic album with bonus discs containing demos and live recordings. Now, demos don't really excite me all too much. I get why they could be interesting, but mostly to me they're just shitty versions of songs I like. But the live stuff, oh baby, that I sink my teeth into. I even made a whole video about it that you're watching right now. The Paranoid Super Deluxe actually has 2 discs of live material of 2 different shows, both from 1970. One from Montreux and the other one from Brussels. It's interesting because both shows were recorded before the release of the Paranoid album, so some of the songs from the record are sang with alternate lyrics, which is pretty interesting. There are also super deluxe versions of Volume 4, Sabotage, and Technical Ecstasy. None for Black Sabbath, Master of Reality, or Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, though. Not yet, at least. And Never Say Die? More like never seeing a re-release. Now that we've covered all these releases, the question is, which one is the best of the best? Well, it's certainly not fucking Cross Purposes Live, so that one's out. Live at Last shouldn't even count, so we'll 86 that too. All the songs on past lives got re-released and remastered, so that one's pointless. So where does that leave us? Is it the rivaling Speak of the Devil or Live Evil? Both are great, but Speak of the Devil is Ozzy's solo band, and Live Evil showcases a new Sabbath lineup. So can we call either of them definitive? So then it has to be Reunion, right? But this album doesn't represent the band their 70s heyday. So maybe the shows from the Super Deluxe versions then. But those are just bonus tracks technically, and they're not as polished as the other releases. Live from Radio City Music Hall is great, but it's technically heaven and hell. What about The End, live in Birmingham, that captures the historic last performance of this legendary band? That one's nice, but Ozzy sounds a bit old, and there's no Bill Ward, and as a lot of fans contend, no Bill Ward equals no Black Sabbath. So at the end of the day, what did I choose as my favorite? As the definitive Black Sabbath live release? Well, I couldn't decide. So I made a tier list. Nah, I'm just fucking with you. I did the old school way and made a playlist. A collection of live tracks across all the releases mentioned, plus a couple I did not. I'm going to share this playlist, which I tinkered on for hours, so I can't wait for you all to fucking hate it and insult me in the comments section. I'm kidding, of course. I actually love all the comments. So if you see this video and are inspired to make a playlist yourself, you happen to disagree, sound off. But before we get into this, we gotta set the ground rules of the playlist. First off, obviously every song on the list has to be a Black Sabbath song. However, it doesn't necessarily need to be performed by Black Sabbath themselves. As long as a member of Sabbath is performing the track, then it's eligible. Sorry, Zach Sabbath. Second, no repeated songs. No one song can appear twice. 3, 1 song per release, and that's it. And finally, I have put these songs in order based on performance date, not release date. So with that all being said, let's jump right into it. Track number 1 on the greatest Black Sabbath live playlist of all time, from Paranoid Super Deluxe, NIB. Had to have this one as one of my favorite tracks by the band. Disappointingly, it lacks a bass intro from the Giesmeister, but overall it's a good performance, and what better way to start a playlist than starting off with a song from the first record. Track number 2, War Pigs from Past Lives. This show is featured on a couple releases, but fuck it counts as a separate release, so I had to include it. I mean, you have to have War Pigs on a Sabbath playlist, right? For track number 3, I selected Snowblind from Volume 4 Super Deluxe. Classic track, and I personally never get tired of Ozzy yelling, "Cocaine!" after all the verses. The next track, number 4, Are You High? So Am I, and that's why it's gotta be Hole in the Sky, from Sabotage Super Deluxe. It doesn't end as abruptly as a studio version, and come on, it's Hole in the Sky we're talking about here. Enough said. Track number 5, again from a Super Deluxe treatment, and I know what you're thinking, this guy's really getting a lot of mileage out of these Super Deluxe versions, and if you thought that, you're exactly right. This time, from the Technical Ecstasy Super Deluxe, Dirty Women. Probably the most popular song from the record. It's a great tune that was taken from the tour supporting the aforementioned album, so I think it's a very worthy inclusion. Finally changing gears a bit is track 6 from Ozzy Osbourne's tribute to Randy Rhoads, it's Children of the Grave. Now this album was released in 1987, but the recording of this track was taken from 1981, hence its placement on the list. One of the most beloved Sabbath tracks, Children of the Grave had to be included. And as far as Rhoads' performance, out of the 3 Sabbath songs featured on Tribute, I feel like Children of the Grave is a song he really puts his own mark and spin on. A different, but really killer rendition of this song. Track 7, from Speak of the Devil, Never Say Die. Now, I could have picked a number of tracks from this album, but Never Say Die is never represented on any of these releases I've heard. Not just the track, but the entire album. So I wanted to include it. Obviously the weakest Ozzy Sabbath album, but the song itself is great, and we simply can't ignore it. Now for track number 8, we've moved on to the Dio era. The next song is Children of the Sea, from Live at Hammersmith Odeon. Now, although this disc was released in 2007, the performance was from January 1st of 1982, so it was actually recorded before Live Evil. Considering Children of the Sea is the first song Dio, Geezer, Iommi wrote together, it makes sense to select it as the first Dio track on this list. For the next track, of course, it's from Live Evil. I had to be economical with my Dio song choice to get all the songs I want on this playlist while abiding by my own rules. So track number 9 is VOODOO. A great song from Mob Rules and a killer performance here. Track 10, here we go. Didn't mention this one prior. From Dio's Live in Donington 83, we have Heaven and Hell. Now, Heaven and Hell is usually the song where Dio does a lot of crowd work, so most live versions are extended. In this performance, it's great because he has a giant festival crowd participating. Now, this is Dio's band, not Sabbath, but they play the song very faithfully. Vivian Campbell doesn't take too many liberties on this one, and it's a very strong performance of a classic song. For the next track, another Dio solo selection from Live in Donington 87, and I know what you're thinking, wasn't that released as a double album with the 83 performance at Donington? And maybe you're right, but on iTunes it's 2 separate albums, and that's what I have, so deal with it. So for track number 11, it's Neon Nights. Maybe the most iconic Dio-era Sabbath song. Here we have a different Dio lineup as Craig Goldie has taken over guitar duties for Vivian Campbell. Goldie does a bit of his own thing, mostly with the end solo, but it's still that classic beloved song. This next one I had some fun with. Now, a little background here. As we know, Ronnie James Dio and Vinny Appice returned to Sabbath in the early 90s to record Dehumanizer, but maybe not everyone knows how this lineup reunion fell apart. Well, Black Sabbath was invited to be an opener for Ozzy Osbourne at Ozzfest 92 in Costa Mesa, an opportunity the band accepted. However, this was not an idea Dio liked at all. For him, it was just an appearance to lube up a reunion between the Birmingham boys, and Dio was quoted as not wanting to open up for a clown. So he stood his ground and let the band days before the performance. Luckily for fans, the metal god himself, from Judas Priest, Rob Halford, stepped in to lend a hand and performed 2 nights with the band at Ozzfest, a heavy metal crossover for the ages, never to be recreated. Until it was in 2004, but we'll get there. Point is, Halford stepped up, he did an amazing job at these shows, and there's a bootleg album of one of the 2 performances called Ozzy Meets the Priest, which includes Black Sabbath's set with Halford, as well as the few songs Sabbath jumped on stage to perform with Ozzy. Without further ado, track number 12 is Symptom of the Universe from Ozzy Meets the Priest. This is a great version of the song. Symptom is one of my favorite tracks, and here it's performed with a great energy. Rob Halford uses higher register, making this track super aggressive. It's Rob's painkiller voice over Sabbath's maybe heaviest track, and the best part is on this version they actually do the slower outro, which I love. In previous live performances that part seems to be cut usually. It's performed on Cross Purposes Live, but here we get Halford singing it and it's awesome. Check this rendition out if you've never heard it. Track number 13, Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath from the Black Sabbath album. It's Black Sabbath as performed on Live and Loud, an Ozzy solo live album that was taken from a tour meant to be his last in 1992. Ha! Anyway, the other 3 members of Sabbath came out to perform with him on his not-so-last tour for a couple of shows. So this track, while it's on an Ozzy Osbourne solo album, it's actually performed by the 4 original members of Black Sabbath. It's a quintessential Sabbath song and my favorite live rendition from any release. Next, track 14, The Mob Rules from Dio live in London, Hammersmith Apollo, 1993. I wouldn't be a true Dio fan if I didn't include this one. The album was released in 2014, but based on the title you probably guessed it, and you did, it was recorded in 1993. Dio is fucking Dio. Again, enough said. Now for the next track, We couldn't leave other Tony out, now could we? Of course not. Come on down, Tony 2. For track 15 from Cross Purposes Live, it's The Headless Cross. Now, I could have picked a Dio or Ozzy era song for this album, but I'm not a fan of those renditions, and I wanted a Tony Martin song to be represented on the list. Like I mentioned earlier, the Martin albums I have not listened to very much, but Headless Cross is my favorite of all his output with the band. It's not really Sabbath, but it's a killer album, and the title track is a great song. Unfortunately here, as I mentioned earlier in the video, Tony Martin doesn't sound super strong. I mean, the chorus of Headless Cross is soaring and high-pitched, but here Martin doesn't even attempt it, which is strange because this is, 1995, so Martin is not old. Why couldn't he hit these notes on this album? Maybe it wasn't his best performance on the tour, but then why did they choose to put this track in there and release it? Because they spent money to record it? I don't know. If someone watching does, lay a comment down. So yeah, in the chorus he doesn't go for the high note, but the backing vocal does. Whether this was one of the band members singing a backing vocal, a backing track, or something that was added in post, I'm not sure. Either way, it's not a bad rendition of the song, it's just different. It's kind of interesting to hear Martin's economical approach to singing this tune. Next up, track 16 from the Blockbuster Reunion album, What Else? Iron Man. The classic comes alive here in this 1999 release, so much so, as I mentioned earlier, it earned the band a Grammy. The crowd is electric as Ozzy pumps them up in the first minute, and the band puts on an epic performance of this Paranoid classic. Here I go cheating again with another bootleg, but the more Sabbath the better, right? For track number 17, it's Into the Void, from Live from Camden, New Jersey, 2004. Of course, there's a million bootlegs you can choose to include, but I wanted to have two to represent both of Rob Halford's performances with the band. This came to be because Ozzy fell ill when Sabbath was to headline Ozfest in 2004. Again, at the last minute, Halford stepped in. This set, unlike the performance in Costa Mesa in '92, contains only Ozzy-era songs, which is what the band had intended to play with their original lead singer. Anyway, I figured we'd give Master Reality a little more love, so Into the Void it is. Up next is track 18 and more Dio. I've chosen the song I from Heaven and Hell's Live from Radio City Music Hall. I needed to have Dehumanizer represented on here, and I is a great track from the original album, and this live collection too. Another performance from Heaven and Hell, track 19 is Time Machine from Neon Nights Live in Europe. I love the Devil You Know album from the band, but since technically it's Heaven and Hell and not Black Sabbath, I chose another song from Dehumanizer. Who doesn't like a little Dehumanizer here and there? I mean, look at this guy. And this guy too, R.I.P. From the End EP comes track 20, End of the Beginning. The 3 of the 4 live tracks in this EP are all from the final studio album 13, which is cool because they don't appear on any other live release. End of the Beginning is the second single off 13 and a banger track, so this was an easy choice. Now for the last track, track 21. You probably know what this one's gonna be. Paranoid from the End, live in Birmingham. Now, is this the best version of Paranoid from all these releases? Not really, but it's not bad. It's really just the impact it has on me for being the last song of the last Sabbath show. Last song the band ever played, it's their classic concert closer, so it's fitting that it's the last track on this playlist. Well, that's it then. 21 tracks running 2 hours and 10 minutes. Yeah, it's a beefy one. So what do you guys think? Did I get it even remotely right? Like I said, let me know your selections in the comments below. Thanks everyone for watching this video. I had a great time making it, so thanks for the support. Until next time, rock fans.